Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really unpack complex topics, cut through the noise and get to what matters. Today we're diving into something that gets talked about a lot, but well, maybe not always understood in its full depth. Muslim culture. And that phrase itself, Muslim culture, that's actually where we need to start because it points to a really common but frankly flawed idea. We often get this picture painted, right, of Muslim culture as this one single thing, like a giant uniform block. But, as the sources we've looked at make incredibly clear, that's just not the reality on the ground, not even close. So our mission today, what we really want to do is take apart that stereotype. We're going to explore the vast, the really rich complexity and, importantly, the internal diversity within Muslim societies all across the globe. Think of it like a journey. We're moving past the easy headlines, the simple answers. We'll look at this incredible tapestry of cultures. We'll carefully deconstruct those narratives about violence and extremism that often get unfairly linked to the faith itself.
We'll also examine the psychological side of things, what it means to be Muslim today. And finally, we're going to tackle Sharia law, a term that, let's be honest, brings up a lot of fear and misunderstanding for many people. And here's something really fascinating, maybe a bit unexpected, that came through in the research. The core insight seems to be that this diversity within the global Muslim community, the Ummah, as it's known, isn't just like a historical accident. For many believers, and it's backed up in their sacred texts, this diversity is actually seen as divinely intended. The Quran itself talks about human societies being naturally pluralistic. It suggests Islam's universal message was kind of designed to bloom within lots of different local contexts. You get this dynamic interplay, between the shared faith and unique cultural ways of life. Okay, let's unpack this. That idea of a single Muslim culture really does just dissolve the moment you look closer. It reveals this amazing mosaic of traditions, values, art. It's really a story of centuries of interaction, of blending things together. Can you maybe walk us through how Islam managed that? How it adapted so dynamically as it spread?
Yeah, it's truly fascinating. You see, Islam spread through various means trade, definitely missionary work, but also through these huge influential empires, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals. And the key thing is instead of just rolling in and imposing a completely rigid alien identity, Islam consistently engaged with local customs, what's often called adat. It was this dynamic process, a synthesis. It wasn't necessarily about people having to abandon their entire cultural heritage. It was more about integrating that local identity as long as it didn't fundamentally clash with the core principles, like Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. That was the bedrock.
Okay, so I think I'm getting this. The point isn't just, there's lots of variety. It's that the faith itself seems to almost, encourage or validate this local expression, like giving it a kind of divine permission slip to have its own flavor.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. It shows Islam was sort of designed to flourish within diverse contexts, not just pave over them. And we see hints of this really early on. There's a well-known example with the Prophet Muhammad himself. During a critical battle, the Battle of the Trench, he actually adopted a military tactic, digging a defensive trench around Medina. This idea came from Salman al-Farsi, one of his companions who was Persian. It wasn't a traditional Arab tactic at all.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it was effective, and the Prophet adopted it. It's seen as this early, powerful precedent for being open to integrating knowledge and customs from other cultures based on their practical wisdom, not just sticking rigidly to one way.
That is a powerful early example.
Yeah.
So this adaptability, this flexibility allowed Islam to really embed itself deeply in incredibly different societies. Can you give us some standout examples? Show us how these fusions looked in different places.
Absolutely. Let's take Persia. So, modern-day Iran. Islam arrives and fuses with this incredibly ancient, sophisticated civilization. It develops into this major center for Shia Islam, but also for profound art, philosophy. Think of those elegant Persian miniature paintings, for instance. That's a direct result of that fusion.
Right, the miniature's stunning.
Or look at the Indian subcontinent, especially under the Mughal Empire. That was a real crucible, a melting pot. You get this remarkable blend of Persian influences with local Indian traditions in art, architecture, how they govern. The Taj Mahal is the obvious, iconic example, right?
Right.
Those bulbous domes, the slender minarets, that incredibly intricate inlaid stonework. It's a perfect synthesis.
Yeah, absolutely iconic.
And then you go to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. Islam mostly arrived there through trade routes, Sufi missionaries.
And we're the largest Muslim population, right?
Yeah, exactly. The world's largest. And what develops there are these wonderfully syncretic forms of faith. You see mosque architecture with multi-tiered roofs that echo traditional Javanese styles, like the Masjid Agung Demak. Or local textile traditions like batik, incorporating Arabic calligraphy and geometric patterns. It's Islam woven into the local fabric. So this constant negotiation, this back and forth between the universal faith and all these diverse local traditions, it creates what scholars sometimes call a permissible space. A space for cultural expression to flourish. And that's the source of the incredible richness we see. And it's important, it's also a source of internal debate, sometimes even tension.
Oh, so.
Well, issues like, say, the role of women in society, or how modesty in dress is defined, or the place of music in religious life. These are often the very areas where that negotiation between the universal and the local is most active, most contested. It really challenges that stereotype of Islam being this static, unchanging thing. It's constantly being lived and interpreted.
That makes sense. So this diversity isn't just in, like, grand history or architecture, but in the everyday stuff, too, like food, clothes, how people interact. How does that permissible space show up in something like cuisine?
Oh, cuisine is a perfect example. You have this universal framework from Islamic dietary laws, the concepts of halal, meaning lawful, haram, meaning forbidden, and also tayyib, which means good, pure, wholesome. But within that framework, the variety is just staggering. Think about, say, Egyptian food versus Lebanese food. Big difference, right?
Totally different flavors.
Exactly. Egyptian cuisine, coming from the Nile Valley, relies heavily on legumes, grains, staples like fulmidadams, that stewed fava bean dish, or kosheri, that amazing mix of rice, lentils, pasta. It's often earthy, very comforting, significant vegetarian influence too, partly from the Coptic Christian tradition there.
Right, kosheri is amazing.
Then contrast that with Lebanese cuisine. That's classic Mediterranean. Lots of fresh vegetables, olive oil, garlic, lemon juice. Famous for mezze, those small plates, hummus. Baba ganoush, tabbouleh. It's lighter, brighter, uses loads of fresh herbs like mint, sumac.
A completely different profile, yeah. But both clearly within that halal framework. Is this variety, this culinary difference, actually, like, supported by Islamic teachings?
Yes, absolutely. It's not just tolerated. You could argue it's theologically sanctioned. There's a very well-known hadith, a saying or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. He was offered a desert lizard to eat a dab, and he personally declined. He didn't find it appealing because it wasn't part of the diet of his people, the Arabs of Mecca.
Okay.
But, and this is the key part, he didn't forbid it for others. He allowed his companion, Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was perhaps more familiar with it or just willing to try it, to eat it. It perfectly illustrates this principle. What is lawful, halal, is permissible. Your personal or cultural taste doesn't make something forbidden for everyone else. People can eat what's familiar and lawful and avoid what isn't, without religious judgment.
That's a really powerful validation of cultural difference, embedded right there. How does this flexibility play out in areas like dress or social interactions?
Dress is another fascinating area where you see this principle at work. Islam doesn't prescribe like a single uniform for all Muslims everywhere. Instead, it provides principles. The main one is modesty, often conceptualized as the clothing of taqwa, or righteousness. The basic requirements generally involve covering certain parts of the body, the ihra, which differs slightly for men and women, avoiding clothing typically associated with the opposite gender, and not imitating specific religious symbols of other faiths.
So guidelines, not a strict dress code.
Exactly. Broad guidelines. And within those, clothing becomes this incredibly vibrant expression of local culture and identity. Think of the bright, colorful saris you see women wearing in Bangladesh, or the flowing thobes and abayas common in the Arabian Peninsula, or the intricate, beautiful batik fabrics in Indonesia and Malaysia. All totally distinct cultural forms, yet all fulfilling those shared principles of modesty in different ways. And social etiquette is similar. You find near universal values rooted in Islamic teachings, like showing hospitality to guests, immense respect for elders. It's huge across the board.
Yeah, hospitality is definitely a recurring theme.
Definitely. But the specific ways these values are expressed can vary a lot depending on local customs. Take Pakistan, for instance. It tends to be a more hierarchical society. So greeting elders first is very important. You inquire about their family, their children. Handshakes between men are common, but often more reserved between men and women who aren't related. If you visit someone's home, it's customary to bring a small gift sweets. Dates are common, never alcohol. And you always, always take off your shoes before entering.
Little rules that signal respect.
Precisely. Now compare that to, say, Malaysia. It's incredibly multicultural. And a really central concept governing social interaction there is face, marua. It's about maintaining honor, dignity, self-esteem, both for yourself and others. So things like direct criticism, showing anger publicly, causing someone embarrassment, these are generally avoided to prevent anyone from losing face. It's all about harmony, social equilibrium, different contexts, different nuances.
Fascinating how those broad values get filtered through local culture. Now let's talk about family. It seems absolutely foundational in most Muslim societies. How is it traditionally understood, and what kind of shifts or challenges is it facing now?
You're right, the family is absolutely central. Traditionally, it's often conceived as a large, extended unit. Think multiple generations living together or very close by, often with a patriarchal structure, though that varies too. This extended family model is deeply valued. It provides stability, security, a built-in network for emotional and financial support. Respect for elders isn't just polite, it's considered a core religious duty. The man is often seen as the primary provider. But yeah, in the modern era, especially with urbanization and migration, particularly for diaspora communities in the West, that traditional model is facing some real pressures.
Like what kinds of pressures?
Well, one major shift is the trend towards nuclear families, just parents and children. While that has its own dynamics, it can sometimes lead to feelings of isolation, a weakening of those traditional support networks that were so vital.
That makes sense. Fewer people immediately around.
Exactly. And then there are significant generational gaps emerging. You have Muslim youth, especially those growing up in Western societies, trying to navigate this really complex space. They're balancing the cultural values, the expectations of their parents' generation who might have grown up elsewhere, with the norms and pressures of the Western society they live in day to day. This can create communication issues, conflicts over lifestyle, marriage choices, careers.
Or a balancing act.
A huge balancing act. And layered on top of these internal shifts are external pressures. Islamophobia is a major one, racism, economic challenges. These add significant stress to families, impacting mental health, how they function. But despite all these challenges, family remains incredibly central, incredibly resilient, and often it's those faith-based values, love, compassion, patience, God consciousness, or taqwa that people draw on to navigate these modern pressures and keep those family bonds strong.
It's really striking how faith provides that resilience. And, that same dynamic we've been talking about, the creative blending, that synthesis, it's maybe nowhere more visually stunning than in the art and architecture across the Muslim world. That almost feels like a visual argument against that whole clash of civilizations idea. It just screams interaction, borrowing, innovation. Could you walk us through some key regional styles?
Absolutely. The art and architecture are just this incredible visual testament to that synthesis. It really does refute the simplistic clash narrative. Instead of imposing one rigid style, Islam's arrival often acted as a catalyst, sparking these amazing regional artistic traditions that absorbed and creatively reinterpreted whatever was there before. It shows a globally connected culture, constantly evolving. Think about Moorish architecture in Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain and North Africa. You go to the Great Mosque of Cordoba.
Oh, the columns.
Exactly. That mesmerizing forest of columns, those distinctive double-tiered horseshoe arches, often with alternating colored stones. It's taking Roman, Byzantine, Visigothic elements and blending them with Islamic design sensibilities, geometric patterns, arabesques, to create something totally new, totally breathtaking. The Alhambra in Granada is another peak of that style.
Just stunning. What about other regions?
Well, jump over to Ottoman Turkey. They developed a really distinct architectural language, especially for mosques. The hallmark becomes the monumental central plan mosque. Think of a massive central dome, seeming almost impossibly large, then supported by a cascade of semi-domes and smaller domes. It creates these vast, unified, light-filled interior spaces. This style was really perfected by the master architect Mimar Sinan in the 16th century. His Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, or the Selimi Mosque in Edirne, they are masterpieces that define an empire's visual identity, often part of larger complexes called kulis too, with schools, hospitals.
A whole civic center around the mosque.
Precisely. And then the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, just an unparalleled artistic synthesis. Persian, Indian, Central Asian elements all coming together. Grandeur, but also incredible delicacy. You see those characteristic bulbous domes, the slender minarets, massive gateways, but also the materials, rich red sandstone contrasted with pure white marble, and the ornamentation. Exquisite carved stone screens called jalis, and that amazing inlaid stonework, pietra dura or Parchankari, using semi-precious stones to create intricate floral designs. The Taj Mahal is the ultimate example, of course, but also Humayun's tomb, the Badshahi Mosque, just incredible richness.
It's amazing how one faith sparks such wildly different, beautiful expressions. What about other art forms like music or poetry?
Yeah, definitely. We can't talk about artistic expression in the Muslim world without talking about Sufism. Sufism, often described as the mystical dimension of Islam, has been this incredibly fertile ground for art aimed at fostering a direct personal experience of the divine. Sufi poetry is legendary. Masters like Jalaluddin Rumi, Hafiz of Shiraz. Their poems explore themes of divine love, spiritual yearning, the soul's journey back to God. This poetry isn't just literature, it's a living tradition, especially in places like Iran.
Rumi is huge, even in the West now.
Absolutely. And often this poetry forms the basis for devotional music. The most famous example internationally is probably Qawwali. That powerful, ecstatic vocal music tradition from South Asia really brought to global fame by artists like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. But there are many other forms too. Nawa music in North Africa, the Mevlevi Ayin ceremonies in Turkey with the whirling dervishes. These aren't just performances, they're spiritual practices, using music and movement to foster higher consciousness, a deeper connection to faith.
So clearly, immense cultural, ethnic, artistic diversity.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier this powerful, unifying sense of shared identity. How does that fit in? How do those two things coexist?
That's a great question. Because you're right, amidst all this incredible diversity we've been exploring, there is this remarkably strong, unifying sense of shared identity that connects Muslims across the globe. It's the concept of the Ummah. And this unity is primarily fostered by a common foundation, a shared set of core beliefs, ethical values, and, crucially, ritual practices. These act like a common language, a framework that connects a Muslim in, say, Senegal to one in Indonesia, creating this truly global community of faith that ideally transcends nationality or ethnicity.
Right.
The clearest example of this unifying framework is probably the 5 pillars of Islam. These are 5 core duties, obligatory acts of worship that really form the bedrock of Muslim life. They're accepted by Muslims pretty much everywhere, regardless of sect, as fundamental.
Can you quickly remind us what they are?
Sure. First is the Shahada, the declaration of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. That's the core creed, the entry point. Second is Salah, the 5 daily ritual prayers performed facing the Kaaba in Mecca. This really structures the day and reinforces humility and connection to God. Friday congregational prayer, Jummah, is also key here for community. Third is zakat, obligatory charity or almsgiving. Usually calculated as 2.5% of one's accumulated wealth annually given to the poor and needy. It embodies Islam's emphasis on social justice, sharing wealth. Fourth is Sawm, fasting during the month of Ramadan, abstaining from food, drink, and other things from dawn till sunset. It's about spiritual discipline, patience, developing empathy for the less fortunate. Also a time of increased prayer, Quran reading, and community gatherings like the iftar meal to break the fast. And fifth is Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Obligatory once in a lifetime for those who are physically and financially able. It involves a series of rituals commemorating events in the life of the Prophet Abraham. Hajj is maybe the most powerful visual symbol of the Ummah's unity. Millions of people from every race, class, corner of the globe standing shoulder to shoulder as equals before God.
It really is incredible how those pillars create this common rhythm, this shared practice that ties millions together.
Exactly. They function as this powerful unifying praxis, shared actions that create and reinforce that global collective identity. This shared ritual experience gives people a common language of faith that can feel even stronger than national or ethnic ties sometimes. It's a source of immense solidarity, spiritual meaning for countless mainstream Muslims. But, and this is a crucial point we'll come back to, that very power of collective identity is precisely what extremist groups try to hijack. They twist this source of unity into a tool for division for their own political ends.
Right. So beyond the shared practices, what about shared values? Are there core ethical principles that cut across all this cultural difference?
Oh, absolutely. Islamic teachings, drawn from the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's example, place a huge emphasis on cultivating a strong moral character, known as akhlaq. Tawhid, that core belief in God's oneness, isn't just theology. It has deep ethical implications. It fosters this sense of fundamental human unity and brotherhood, ideally erasing distinctions of race or nationality. Allah, or justice, is paramount. The Quran commands believers to stand firm for justice, even if it's against themselves, their parents, or their kin. Standing against oppression is a major theme. Then there's akhlaq itself, cultivating virtues like honesty, integrity, kindness, compassion, humility, patience, forgiveness. There's a strong emphasis on kindness to parents, neighbors, even strangers. Taqwa, which is often translated as God consciousness or mindfulness of God, acts like an internal moral compass, guiding believers towards righteous actions and away from wrongdoing. And ikhlas, or sincerity, doing deeds purely for the sake of God, not for show or personal gain. Taken together, these shared values provide this moral framework. They encourage self-discipline, promote harmony in relationships, and lay the foundation for building a just, compassionate society.
Okay, let's pivot now, because we have to address the elephant in the room, the central concern that often dominates conversations about Islam today. Is it inherently dangerous? This question usually stems from the horrific acts of violence committed by extremist groups claiming to act in Islam's name. But our deep dive requires us to make a really sharp distinction, based on evidence, between the beliefs and practices of the overwhelming majority. We're talking nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide, and the specific, often very modern, political ideologies of a violent fringe. And what's striking in the evidence is that the main target of these extremist groups, ideologically and often militarily, isn't actually the West. It's often the mainstream Muslim world itself. Their project seems to be more internal, revolutionary, trying to overthrow existing Muslim societies they label as apostate.
That distinction is absolutely critical. When we use the term Islamic extremism, and it's a contested term, we should note we're generally talking about ideologies held by a very small minority. These ideologies are typically marked by extremely rigid, intolerant interpretations of religion, and crucially, the use of violence to achieve political goals. It's important, too, to differentiate this from related terms, like Islamism, which refers broadly to political Islam seeking to implement Islamic principles in public life, but which can be entirely nonviolent and participatory, or even Islamic fundamentalism, which might just mean a desire to return to what are seen as the fundamentals of the faith, not necessarily involving violence or a specific political program. They can overlap, but they aren't the same thing.
Okay, so when we talk about groups like ISIS or Daesh, who are they really? Where do these extreme ideas actually come from? Are they rooted deep in Islamic tradition?
That's the key question, and the answer is largely no, not in the way they claim. If you look back to the very early days of Islam, like the 7th century, there was this group called the Kharijites. They were infamous for their extremism, particularly their readiness to declare other Muslims who disagreed with them on political or theological points as kuffar, non-believers. This practice is called takfir.
Declaring fellow Muslims as non-believers.
Exactly. And crucially, they often believed these apostates deserved death. This radical tendency towards internal excommunication, declaring huge swaths of the Muslim community outside the fold of Islam, is a defining feature we see echoed in modern extremist groups. But groups like ISIS today aren't direct descendants in a continuous line. Their ideology is better understood as a modern kind of hybrid concoction. It often fuses a particularly rigid literalist interpretation of Salafism specifically, a strand influenced by Wahhabism with 20th century political theories, particularly from figures like the Egyptian Islamist Sayyid Qutb, who wrote about society being in the state of pre-Islamic ignorance, Jahiliyyah. And the core tenets of this modern extremist ideology put them in direct, violent opposition to mainstream Islam in several crucial ways.
That's a really critical point, that these groups often reject centuries of established Islamic scholarship. For someone listening, what's the practical difference? How does, say, a traditional scholar's view of justice differ so much from an ISIS-type interpretation?
The differences are fundamental. First, there's the extreme takfirism we mentioned. ISIS ideology is built on declaring almost everyone outside their own small group as apostates, including most other Muslims, even other Salafis. Even groups like Al-Qaeda often fall under their condemnation. They genuinely seem to believe that mainstream Muslim societies have fallen back into the state of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, and need to be forcibly reconquered. This is a massive departure from traditional Islamic law, which historically placed extremely strict conditions on declaring someone an apostate, precisely to prevent this kind of misuse for political ends.
So they're basically excommunicating the entire world.
Pretty much. Second, there's a profound rejection of the established scholarly tradition. ISIS and similar groups dismiss centuries of Islamic jurisprudence, the 4 major Sunni schools of law that have guided Muslims for over 1,000 years. They just brush it aside. In its place, their ideologues substitute their own interpretations, often demonstrably self-serving and ripped out of context, claiming they alone understand the true Islam. And third, many of these groups, particularly ISIS, have this strong apocalyptic millenarian streak, an obsessive belief that the final day of judgment is just around the corner, that they are key players in these end times battles, which they use to justify unbelievable brutality. This is far removed from mainstream Islamic eschatology. So this whole ideological package fundamentally reframes the conflict. It's not really Islam versus the West, as it's often portrayed. It's more like a small, radical revolutionary cult against the entire established global order, including, and perhaps especially, mainstream Islam.
That's a really powerful reframing. So how has the mainstream Muslim world responded to groups like ISIS? We often hear this narrative in the media, the silent Muslim trope. Is that accurate?
That silent Muslim narrative is demonstrably false. And frankly, quite pernicious. The reality is that mainstream Islamic scholars, leaders, and institutions across the globe have overwhelmingly, consistently, and forcefully rejected and condemned the ideology and actions of groups like ISIS. They view these groups not just as politically problematic, but as dangerous, heretical deviations from authentic Islamic teachings. This condemnation is deeply theological, not just political posturing. Take, for example, the prominent Syrian scholar Sheikh Mohammed al-Yaqoubi. He wrote a whole book titled Refuting ISIS. In it, he systematically dismantles their claims using classical Islamic legal principles. He argues ISIS is neither Islamic nor a state, but basically a deviant cult driven by hatred and lust for power. He details how their specific actions, like enslaving Yazidi women, destroying mosques, churches, shrines, torturing prisoners, killing civilians, are all in direct, flagrant violation of established Islamic law, Sharia.
So he uses their own claimed framework against them.
Precisely. His conclusion is stark. ISIS members, through their ideology and actions, have effectively placed themselves outside the fold of Sunni Islam. He explicitly calls them modern-day Kharijites, echoing that early extremist sect, and he argues it's actually an obligation for mainstream Muslims to oppose and fight them.
Wow. So this condemnation is coming from within, using theological arguments.
Yeah.
Is this a widely held view among scholars?
Oh, absolutely. This kind of theological refutation is far from isolated. Even major scholars within the Salafi and Wahhabi traditions, the very schools of thought from which ISIS distorts its inspiration, have unequivocally denounced the group. You have prominent Saudi scholars, for instance, labeling ISIS a rogue criminal organization, declaring its self-proclaimed caliphate completely illegitimate. There's even a striking story about a former teacher of the late ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi publicly condemning him as ignorant and deviant, saying he hadn't mastered even basic texts. This internal rejection, coming from the highest levels of Islamic scholarship, including from within the traditions they falsely claim to represent, really highlights the deep, unbridgeable chasm between the faith of the vast majority and the violent ideology of this extremist fringe. And contrary to that harmful silent Muslim narrative, these condemnations have been loud, clear, and consistent. Mainstream Muslim leaders, scholars, major organizations worldwide, they've issued countless statements grounded in theology, rejecting extremist violence. These often just don't get the same media attention as the violence itself, but they represent a powerful counter-narrative from within the Islamic tradition.
What's the most authoritative way for Islamic scholars to make these kinds of condemnations official?
The most authoritative tool they have is the fatwa. A fatwa is a formal religious ruling, an expert legal opinion issued by a qualified scholar or a council of scholars. These aren't just like press releases, they carry significant religious weight. Issuing a fatwa against terrorism is essentially an act of theological and legal warfare, using the instruments of Islamic tradition itself to delegitimize extremist groups on religious grounds. One really significant example, especially in the North American context, is the fatwa against terrorism issued by the Fiqh Council of North America, FCNA, which is a body of Islamic legal scholars. This fatwa was endorsed by hundreds of American Muslim organizations, leaders, imams. It's incredibly clear.
What does it say specifically?
It reaffirms Islam's absolute condemnation of terrorism and religious extremism. It explicitly declares that targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure using any method, including suicide bombings, is haram, strictly forbidden, in Islam. It states unequivocally that those who commit these barbaric acts are criminals, not martyrs. And crucially, it states that it is haram forbidden for any Muslim to cooperate with individuals or groups involved in terrorism. And it goes further, establishing a civic and religious duty for Muslims to cooperate with law enforcement to protect the lives of all civilians. It's a very strong stance.
That is strong. Is this kind of statement common globally?
Yes, the FCNA fatwa is just one example. You see similar strong condemnations from the world's most prestigious Islamic institutions. After 9/11, for instance, Sheikh Mohammed Said al-Tantawi, who was the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, at the time arguably the most influential center of Sunni learning globally, stated very forcefully, "Attacking innocent people is not courageous. It is stupid and will be punished on the Day of Judgment." Similarly, the Council of Senior Ulama in Saudi Arabia, their highest religious body, issued a fatwa back in 2003 condemning the shedding of innocent blood as a criminal act against Islam, labeling the perpetrators as having deviant beliefs. So there's this vast global chorus of condemnation coming from authoritative Muslim voices.
And it's crucial that these aren't just political reactions, they're deeply rooted in the faith itself. What are the core teachings they draw on to make these arguments?
Absolutely. It's vital to understand these condemnations aren't just about political expediency. They are firmly grounded in the primary sources of Islamic law and ethics, the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices. Scholars consistently point to foundational texts. For example, a key verse from the Quran, chapter 5, verse 32, which states, more or less, that whoever kills a soul, it is as though he has slain all mankind entirely, and whoever saves one it is as though he has saved all mankind. This establishes the immense sanctity of every single human life.
That's incredibly powerful.
It is. There's also a famous hadith where the Prophet Muhammad warns believers, essentially telling them not to be mindless followers, but to do good even if others do evil, and not to do wrong just because others are doing wrong. This is used to argue strongly against retaliatory violence or collective punishment. Another key verse, Quran 5.2, commands believers to help one another in virtue and righteousness, but do not help one another in sin and transgression. This is often cited to argue that cooperating with terrorists is religiously forbidden. And finally, there's the concept of the middle way from Quran 2.143, thus we have made you a community justly balanced. This is used to show that Islam itself mandates moderation and balance and explicitly condemns extremism, gulu, in religious matters. By grounding their refutations firmly in scripture and tradition, mainstream scholars are engaged in this critical internal religious struggle. They're actively fighting to reclaim the narrative of their faith from those who would distort and hijack it for violent political agendas.
Okay, let's tackle another hugely misunderstood term, jihad. In popular Western discourse, unfortunately, it's become almost synonymous with terrorism, holy war. But this seems to be a result of deliberate distortion by extremist groups, twisting a complex religious concept for their own ends. So, what is the authentic meaning of jihad in Islamic tradition? How has it been distorted?
You're absolutely right. The popular understanding is often a distortion. Classical Islamic theology has long recognized a multifaceted meaning for jihad. The most famous articulation of this is probably the distinction made in a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Returning from a military campaign, he reportedly told his followers that they had returned from the lesser jihad, jihad al-asghar, to the greater jihad, jihad al-akbar.
Lesser and greater, what's the difference?
The greater jihad, he explained, is the internal spiritual struggle. It's the struggle against one's own ego, nafs, against base desires, against laziness, arrogance, greed, all the internal moral failings. This inner struggle for self-purification, for becoming a better person, for striving to live righteously according to God's commands, that is considered the primary, the most important, and the most difficult form of jihad. The lesser jihad refers to the outer, physical struggle. This can involve striving to uphold justice in society, defending the community or faith from attack, or even undertaking legitimate warfare under specific conditions. It can include nonviolent forms like activism, speaking truth to power, but it can include physical fighting.
So if the internal spiritual struggle is the greater jihad, how do extremist groups flip this?
That's exactly what they do. They flip it, or rather, they deliberately ignore the distinction altogether. Violent extremist groups essentially erase the primacy of the spiritual struggle. They collapse the two meanings and focus exclusively on a warped, absolutist interpretation of the lesser jihad, specifically the dimension of physical fighting. In their ideology, jihad becomes this perpetual state of total war against anyone they deem an enemy, any society they label as kafir or apostate. And this interpretation is a direct violation of the incredibly detailed ethical constraints and rules of engagement known as adab al-qitl that were developed over centuries within mainstream Islamic jurisprudence.
Rules of engagement, like...
Yes, classical Islamic law, while accepting that warfare might sometimes be necessary as a legitimate act of state, primarily for defense, places very strict limits on how it can be conducted. These rules are derived directly from the Quran and the Sunnah. They include things like the absolute prohibition of killing non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, monks, priests, rabbis, anyone not actively fighting, prohibition of wanton destruction of property, cutting down fruit trees, killing livestock unnecessarily, destroying buildings, prohibition of attacking places of worship, prohibition of mutilating the bodies of the dead, And very importantly, classical Islamic law generally requires that warfare be declared and waged by a legitimate state authority, not by vigilante groups or individuals.
Okay, so how do groups like ISIS measure up against those classical Islamic rules of warfare?
They fail spectacularly on every single count. Extremist groups like ISIS systematically, deliberately, and often proudly violate every one of these foundational principles. Their intentional targeting of civilians, their destruction of cultural heritage sites, including mosques and shrines, their use of horrific cruelty like beheadings and torture, broadcasting it to the world. These actions are not an application of Islamic law, they are a flagrant repudiation of it. They have effectively taken a complex religious concept with a rich ethical and spiritual history and twisted it into a simplistic, brutal justification for political violence and terror. Their use of the term jihad isn't authentic to the tradition. It's a modern political invention designed to legitimize an ideology that the tradition itself roundly condemns.
So what does this all mean? It seems the perception of Islam as dangerous isn't just about what extremists do. It's also actively constructed, amplified by, well, a media environment that's often biased, and it taps into some deep historical prejudices. This phenomenon, Islamophobia, it's not just a simple fear, right? It's more like a specific kind of bigotry with real consequences. Can you unpack what Islamophobia really is?
Exactly. It's helpful to think of Islamophobia less like a personal psychological phobia, like arachnophobia, and more as a social anxiety, often intertwined with xenophobia or racism directed specifically at Muslims or those perceived as Muslim. The Runnymede Trust in the UK back in 1997 gave a really influential definition. They described it as an unfounded dread and dislike of Muslims, which results in practices of exclusion and discrimination. This bigotry tends to manifest through a set of distorted, closed views about Islam and Muslims.
Like what kind of views?
Things like seeing Islam as this single monolithic block, static, unchanging, refusing to adapt. Perceiving Islam and Muslim cultures as fundamentally separate, alien, the other, lacking shared values with other cultures, particularly the West. Thinking of Islam as inherently inferior, barbaric, irrational, primitive, sexist, directly equating Islam with violence, aggression, terrorism, supporting the clash of civilizations thesis, and treating Islam primarily as a political ideology bent on domination rather than a faith. These distorted views then become the justification for discriminating against Muslims, excluding them from society, and making anti-Muslim hostility seem acceptable, even normal.
Where do these negative ideas come from? They feel older than just the last 20 years.
Oh, they are much older. This modern form of prejudice has really deep historical roots going way back before the current conflicts. Many scholars trace a lineage back to medieval Europe. Think about the propaganda used to justify the Crusades, or the rhetoric during the Reconquista in Spain, which led to the expulsion and persecution of Muslims and Jews, sometimes framed in racialized terms like limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Later, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Europe, culminating in events like the Siege of Vienna in 1683, definitely entrenched anxieties and othering narratives. Then, during the colonial era, these prejudices were kind of formalized and intellectualized through what the scholar Edward Said famously termed Orientalism.
Right. Said's work on Orientalism is key here.
Absolutely. Orientalism, as Said described it, was this Western academic and artistic tradition that constructed a vision of the Orient, including the Islamic world, as exotic, sensual, but also irrational, stagnant, despotic, fundamentally different from the rational West. This framework provided a powerful ideological justification for colonial rule. And then, tragically, after the 9/11 attacks, these long dormant historical prejudices were sort of reactivated and massively amplified on a global scale, largely through mass media.
How does this play out in media stereotypes today? And what's the actual impact on people?
We see it constantly. The most pervasive stereotype is definitely the Muslim as terrorist. Violence becomes almost inseparable from the image of Islam in much media coverage. Think about how often when a violent act is committed by someone who identifies as Muslim, their religious identity is front and center in the reporting. But when the perpetrator is from another background, their religion is often downplayed or ignored entirely. This creates a false, dangerous association in the public mind. Shows like Homeland or films like American Sniper have faced criticism for reinforcing these tropes.
All right, that double standard is noticeable.
Definitely. Another really common stereotype is the oppressed Muslim woman. Muslim women are often depicted either as passive, silent victims of a patriarchal religion needing rescue, or occasionally as rebels fighting against their faith. The hijab, the headscarf, is almost universally framed in Western media as a symbol of forced submission, completely ignoring the agency, the diverse motivations, the expressions of faith and identity that lead many women to choose to wear it. Remember the driving ban in Saudi Arabia? Often framed as Islamic, but there was no specific Quranic basis for it. It was a political and cultural decision.
That's a crucial distinction.
And then there's the manipulation of scripture. Anti-Muslim activists and sometimes just poorly informed media figures love to pull Quranic verses completely out of context to prove Islam is violent. A classic example is Quran 2.191 and kill them wherever you find them. It gets thrown around constantly.
Without the context.
Exactly. Without mentioning, it was revealed during a specific historical period of active warfare, referring to enemy combatants who had broken treaties and were actively fighting the early Muslim community, not a general command to kill non-Muslims anywhere, anytime. They completely ignored the immediate surrounding verses that restrict fighting and the countless other verses throughout the Quran that command justice, peace, forgiveness, protecting innocent life. This constant biased narrative has a real direct impact. It demonstrably fuels public fear, animosity. This creates a political climate where discriminatory policies like bans on minarets or face coverings become more palatable. And it creates this dangerous feedback loop. The dangerous Muslim narrative leads to marginalization, discrimination, alienation. And that very alienation can then be exploited by extremist recruiters. They come along and say, see, the West hates you, they'll never accept you. We are your only true protectors. So ironically, Islamophobia, far from combating extremism, can actually inadvertently become a factor contributing to the radicalization it claims to oppose.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to another really interesting angle. A listener specifically asked about a psychological component to the culture. And what emerges from the research is fascinating. Being Muslim today, especially in certain contexts, involves this complex interplay between internal faith and external pressures. This creates unique challenges, but also unique models of healing and well-being that blend faith with modern psychology.
That's absolutely right. For many Muslims, particularly young people growing up in the West or in secularized societies, identity isn't something just passively received. It's an active, often challenging process of negotiation. They're constantly working to reconcile the values and practices of their faith and their family heritage with the norms, expectations, and sometimes the hostility of the dominant secular culture around them. This process can definitely be a source of psychological distress, but interestingly, it also seems to foster incredible strength and resilience.
How do they navigate that, especially when facing things like Islamophobia we just discussed? What are the components of that identity they're juggling?
Well, Islamic identity itself isn't just one thing. It's multifaceted. There's the core aqidah, the faith, belief in God's oneness. There are the morals and religious practices like prayer, fasting, ethical conduct. There's heritage connection to history, art, maybe a specific language like Arabic or Urdu or Farsi. And there's the spiritual and psychological formation internalizing values like compassion, justice, patience. Now, navigating how these fit together with, say, American or British or French identity, especially when faced with modern challenges, is complex. You have religious extremism distorting the faith, forcing young people into a defensive posture. You have globalization pushing Western consumer culture, which might clash with values of modesty or anti-materialism. And then you have Islamophobia, the discrimination, the microaggressions constantly questioning their belonging, impacting their mental health.
It sounds exhausting.
It can be. Psychologists who study identity development, like Erik Erikson or James Marcia, talk about stages like moratorium, where individuals actively explore different identities before committing. Many young Muslims seem to be in this space, actively working to reconcile their faith with modern life. But here's that paradox again. Despite these immense pressures, research often finds surprising resilience. One study looking at Muslim American college students, for example, found that while they did face extra challenges due to discrimination and identity negotiation, they actually reported higher levels of psychological well-being and self-esteem than might be predicted.
Higher? How does that work?
It seems the very process of consciously navigating these difficulties, of actively integrating these potentially conflicting identities into a cohesive, multicultural self, can actually foster a stronger, more resilient sense of identity. It's resilience forged in the face of adversity.
That's truly remarkable. And partly in response to these unique needs, this field called Islamic psychology has emerged. What exactly is it? How does it differ from, say, standard Western psychology?
Yeah, Islamic psychology, or IP, has really gained momentum in recent decades. It emerged partly out of a sense that purely secular models of psychology weren't fully equipped to address the spiritual and existential dimensions of life that are so central for many Muslims. You could see it as a form of intellectual and therapeutic decolonization, an effort to build a framework for mental health and well-being that is authentic to the community's worldview, rooted in its own rich intellectual and spiritual traditions, rather than just importing Western models wholesale.
So what does that framework look like? What are its core ideas?
At its heart, IP is a holistic approach. It sees the human being not just as a mind and body, but as possessing a soul that has an innate connection to the divine. This contrasts with what proponents see as the more materialist or secular focus of much conventional Western psychology. It draws heavily on the Quran, the Sunnah, and the insights of classical Islamic scholars who wrote extensively about the human psyche, figures like Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in the 9th century or the famous Al-Ghazali in the 11th century. The core belief is that true healing and flourishing come fundamentally through strengthening that connection with God and through a process of purifying the soul or self-taskiyat an-nafs. The goal isn't just symptom reduction or, getting people back to functioning in a capitalist society. It's about helping them uncover their fitra, their innate, pure, God-given human nature, and achieving a state of inner balance, peace, and wholeness.
That sounds like a fundamentally different goal for therapy. How does this translate into practice? What does an Islamic model of the psyche look like in a therapy session?
IP often works with a multi-layered model of the psyche. There's the ruh, the pure spirit, our connection to God. There's the qalb, the heart, seen as the spiritual and emotional center, capable of knowing God but also susceptible to spiritual diseases. There's the aql, the intellect or reason. And then there's the nafs, often translated as the lower self or ego, the seat of base desires, impulses, negative emotions that can veil the heart. The therapeutic aim, essentially, is to purify the nafs, polish the mirror of the qalb so it can reflect the light of the ruh, and use the aql wisely in this process.
Okay, interesting model. How do therapists actually work with that?
Different models and techniques are developing. One approach is called Traditional Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, or TIIP. It tries to blend insights from behavioral sciences with this Islamic model of the psyche. It uses spiritual approaches rooted in tazkiyah, soul purification, but might also adapt mainstream techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, if they're seen as consistent with Islamic principles. There's also a practical framework some use called the iceberg model. It maps interventions onto those different levels of the soul we talked about. So at the surface level, the nafs visible behavior interventions might involve lifestyle changes, engaging more consistently in religious practices like prayer. Deeper down at the aql cognition level, you might use CBT to challenge dysfunctional thoughts. Deeper still, at the qalb emotion heart, therapists might use emotional regulation techniques, contemplative practices drawn from Islamic tradition like muhasabah, self-reflection, or muraqabah meditation, maybe even somatic techniques. And at the very core, the ruh spirit, the focus is on spiritual practices like dhikr, remembrance of God, ibadah, worship, fostering that direct connection.
So integrating techniques we might recognize like CBT, but within this Islamic framework.
Exactly. Integrating things like mindfulness, but framing it through Islamic concepts like sabr, patience, or muraqabah. Using positive psychology concepts, but linking them to shukr, gratitude. Using techniques for processing trauma, but connecting them to tawbah, repentance, and turning back to God. The goal is to build a system of healing that addresses the whole person, mind, body, and spirit within a framework of meaning and faith that resonates deeply with the patient.
That makes a lot of sense. But even with these emerging models, what are some of the real-world barriers? Why might Muslims still struggle to access mental health care?
Yeah, despite these rich resources within the tradition, many Muslim communities face significant hurdles when it comes to mental health care. It's often a complex mix of internal cultural factors like stigma and external systemic challenges. Stigma is a huge issue in many communities. Mental illness is often poorly understood. It might get misinterpreted through a spiritual or moral lens, seen as a punishment from God, a sign of weak faith, a result of spirit possession, jinn, or just a personal failing.
So people feel ashamed.
Deeply ashamed, often hopeless. They become very reluctant to talk about their struggles, let alone seek professional help outside the family or immediate community. There's often a fear of bringing dishonor. The first port of call might be a faith leader, an imam, or a sheikh. And they might rely heavily on prayer, reading the Quran, spiritual remedies as coping mechanisms. While these can be incredibly powerful and comforting, they often aren't sufficient on their own to address severe clinical conditions like major depression, psychosis, or complex trauma.
And what about the external challenges?
Well, especially in the West, there's often a fear or distrust of secular mental health professionals. Will they understand my faith? Will they respect my values? Will they pathologize my religious beliefs? There's a history sometimes of negative experiences. And the healthcare system itself is often just not equipped. There's a lack of culturally and linguistically competent providers, therapists who understand the nuances of Islamic faith and diverse Muslim cultures. There aren't enough bridging professionals. Globally, the picture is also very uneven. In conflict zones like Syria or Yemen, mental health services are devastated, despite overwhelming need due to trauma. In wealthier countries like Saudi Arabia, infrastructure is expanding, but stigma might still be high. In places like Iran, there's growing awareness, especially around issues like addiction, integrating scientific approaches within a conservative society.
So what are the solutions? How do we bridge this gap?
The most promising solutions seem to lie in integration, not opposition, breaking down the false dichotomy between the spiritual and the clinical. We're seeing a growing recognition, especially among younger, more urban Muslims, of the value of blended approaches, like that Islamically integrated psychotherapy we discussed. Imams and community leaders have a crucial role to play in educating their communities, destigmatizing mental illness, encouraging people to seek help when needed. And clinicians need training to provide culturally sensitive care that respects and incorporates patients' spiritual values. It needs to be a partnership.
We talked earlier about Islamophobia as this external pressure, this sort of ambient stress. Can you delve a bit deeper into what that lived experience is like? What's the day-to-day psychological toll?
Yeah. Ambient stress is a good way to put it. Islamophobia isn't just about major hate crimes, though those happen. It's often this constant low-level hum of suspicion, scrutiny, and potential hostility in everyday life. It forces individuals into the state of hypervigilance, constantly assessing risk, monitoring their own behavior, their speech, even their appearance, wondering how they'll be perceived. It profoundly constrains the ability to just be in public space freely, spontaneously, without that background anxiety.
Can we quantify that? How prevalent is it and what's the impact?
There's sobering data on this. A major U.S. survey from 2021 found that over two-thirds, 67.5% of American Muslims reported personally experiencing Islamophobia, and the numbers are even higher for those who are more visibly identifiable. Muslim women, particularly those who wear hijab, reported rates of 76.7%, and young people aged 18-29 reported the highest rates at 81.2%.
Wow, over 80% for young people.
Yeah. These experiences aren't abstract. They include verbal harassment on the street, kids being bullied at school, called terrorists, having their hijabs pulled off, physical assaults, constant online hate, but also more subtle institutional discrimination in hiring, housing, dealing with law enforcement, or airport security. And the cumulative impact on mental health is severe. In that same survey, a staggering 93.7% of those who experience Islamophobia said it affected their mental and emotional well-being.
92%.
Almost everyone. They reported feelings of anger, anxiety, depression, fear, insecurity, paranoia. One respondent captured it poignantly, saying they felt people were scared of us being different. There's this sense of being perpetually judged and misunderstood, which can lead to internalizing those negative stereotypes.
That's incredibly damaging. Does this lead to changes in behavior like self-censorship?
Absolutely. That's one of the most insidious effects. The fear generated by Islamophobia leads to widespread self-censorship. In that U.S. survey, an astonishing 88.2% of Muslims said they censor their speech or actions in some way out of fear of how others might react.
Nearly 9 out of 10.
Yes. And nearly a third, 32.9%, reported having actually hidden their religious identity at some point to avoid potential discrimination or hostility. Think about the implications of that. If a large segment of the population feels they can't speak freely about their faith, their concerns, their experiences, it severely compromises their civic engagement. It hinders trust, makes it harder to build bridges between communities. It creates this chilling effect on free expression and participation. And compounding this is underreporting. Over half of those who experienced an Islamophobic incident didn't report it, often because they didn't know where or how, or felt nothing would be done.
Yet, amidst all this negativity, you keep mentioning this paradox of resilience. How do people cope? Where does the strength come from?
It's a crucial part of the story. Because while Islamophobia is undeniably harmful, the data also shows that a strong religious identity can act as a powerful psychological buffer. Remember that finding about Muslim women wearing hijab? While it made them targets for discrimination, it was also linked to positive psychological outcomes in some studies, perhaps fostering a stronger sense of self, community connection, divine reliance. Other research suggests that engaging in regular Islamic practices, like the 5 daily prayers, can help buffer the negative mental health impacts of discrimination. We saw it with the Muslim American college students showing high resilience despite facing unique stressors. For many, their faith and the solidarity of their community provide this deep wellspring of strength, pride, meaning, purpose. It helps them navigate, resist, and find resilience even in a hostile environment. It's a testament to the power of faith as a resource.
Okay, let's shift gears now to probably the most loaded term of all when we talk about Islam in the West. Sharia law. It conjures up images, often quite scary ones, monolithic, barbaric, anti-modern, maybe even poised for some kind of global takeovers. This narrative is pervasive, but as our research shows, it's a profound distortion. So our goal here is to deconstruct those myths. Let's get into the reality, what Sharia truly means, how it's interpreted, and how it's actually applied around the world. Can you start us off? What is Sharia, and what's the absolute key distinction we need to grasp?
Absolutely. To understand Sharia properly, we have to start with its meaning, its goals, and crucially, that distinction between divine law and human interpretation. The Arabic word Sharia literally means the path to the waterhole. It's a metaphor for the right path to follow, the divinely ordained way of life revealed by God. So it's much broader than just law in the Western sense. It encompasses a whole body of religious principles, ethical guidelines, rules governing worship, social interaction, family life, business, basically, guidance for all aspects of life. For many Muslims, the word Sharia is fundamentally synonymous with justice, with God's guidance towards good. But here is the single most critical point to understand, the one that unlocks so much confusion, the distinction between Sharia and fiqh.
Sharia and fiqh, okay.
Sharia is understood by Muslims as the divine law itself, perfect, eternal, immutable, as revealed by God in the Quran and through the example Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. It's the sacred, abstract ideal, the divine blueprint. Fiqh, on the other hand, literally means understanding. It refers to human jurisprudence, the intellectual effort by scholars over centuries to understand, interpret, and derive specific practical legal rulings from the divine sources of Sharia. So fiqh is a human endeavor. Therefore, it is inherently fallible, changeable, diverse. There isn't one monolithic fiqh. There are multiple schools of thought, ongoing debates, evolution over time.
Okay, wait. So if I'm hearing you right, the common Western fear about Sharia taking over is actually in reality a fear of specific interpretations of fiqh. Human interpretations that can and do differ and change.
Precisely. That is the absolute key takeaway. When a country implements a law claiming it's based on Islamic principles, it's not implementing the divine abstract Sharia directly. It's codifying a specific interpretation, a specific school of fiqh's understanding of what Sharia requires in a particular context. This codified law is a human legal code. It's historically contingent, influenced by culture and politics, and absolutely open to critique, debate, and reform from within the Islamic tradition itself. This distinction immediately explains how you can have dozens of Muslim-majority countries all claiming allegiance to Sharia, yet possessing vastly different legal systems, approaches to governance, human rights records. They're applying different interpretations of fiqh.
Makes so much more sense. It breaks down that monolithic image.
Exactly. It moves us away from fearing this abstract, scary Sharia and allows us to engage critically with specific human-made laws and legal systems, recognizing the potential for internal diversity and reform. Now, how do scholars arrive at these fiqh rulings? They use established principles of jurisprudence called usul al-fiqh. The primary sources are the Quran itself, then the Sunnah, the Prophet's example, then ijma, the consensus of qualified scholars, though defining this is complex, and qiyas, analogical reasoning, applying rulings from the text to new situations. And this whole legal ethical system is supposed to be guided by the maqasid al-sharia, the higher objectives or goals of the Sharia. Classical scholars identified 5 core essentials that the law aims to preserve and protect: religion, deen, life, nafs, intellect, aqwa, lineage or family, nasl, and property or wealth, mal. Any valid ruling in fiqh should ultimately serve to uphold these fundamental human necessities, aiming for justice, adl, fairness, and mercy, rahma.
Okay, got it. So that theory makes sense. But what about the Sharia takeover narrative? The idea that there's this creeping imposition of a single legal system, how does that stack up against the actual data? How is Muslim law really used in national legal systems today?
Yeah, that narrative completely falls apart when you look at the data. The reality on the ground isn't some monolithic march towards theocracy. It's an incredibly complex patchwork of hybrid legal systems. Each country's system is shaped by its unique history, its political culture, often its colonial past. If you look at comparative law databases like JuryGlobe from the University of Ottawa, you find that only a very small handful of countries operate with Muslim law as their sole or primary legal system. Think maybe Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Maldives. The vast majority of Muslim-majority countries have mixed systems. Sharia is one influence, often alongside civil law, inherited from French or continental systems, or common law, inherited from British rule. And very often, the application of Sharia-derived law, fiqh, is specifically limited to personal status matters, things like marriage contracts, divorce proceedings, inheritance laws. Criminal law, commercial law, constitutional law are often based on secular models.
Can you give some examples of these mixes?
Sure. You have countries like Egypt, Algeria, Iran described as having mixed systems of Muslim law and civil law. Then countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria in the northern states mix Muslim law with common law, a clear legacy of British colonialism. Then you have even more complex mixes like Bahrain or Qatar incorporating multiple traditions. And of course you have explicitly secular states like Turkey, where Ataturk undertook a deliberate project of secularization in the early 20th century, replacing Sharia-based codes with European ones. So the data clearly shows that the legal identity of most modern Muslim nations is often shaped more profoundly by their 20th century political history, by colonialism, nationalism, secularization projects, than by their 7th century religious origins. The Sharia takeover narrative is just fundamentally ahistorical. It ignores these crucial factors.
Okay, that's the state level.
Yeah.
What about public opinion? Do Muslims themselves actually want Sharia to be the official law? And if they do, what does Sharia mean to them? Is it the harsh punishments we often hear about?
Public opinion data, mostly from the Pew Research Center's extensive surveys, adds another layer of complexity. It's not a simple yes or no. Support for making Sharia the official law of the land varies hugely by region. It's generally high in South Asia, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, North Africa region. But it's much lower, often very low, in other regions like Southeast Europe, Balkans, Central Asia, or among Muslims living in Western Europe or North America.
So not universal support by any means.
Not at all. And even where support is high, there are crucial nuances that often get lost in the headlines. First, a significant proportion of those who support Sharia believe its laws should apply only to the Muslim population of their country, not necessarily to non-Muslim minorities. Second, and perhaps most importantly, support for the specific, severe criminal punishments often associated with Sharia in the West. The hudud punishments like stoning for adultery or cutting off hands for theft is significantly lower than general support for Sharia as official law.
Ah, that's a key difference.
A massive difference. For example, in the Middle East, North Africa, while general support for Sharia might be around 74%, support for corporal punishment is lower, around 57%. There's a gap. People might want laws reflecting Islamic values in family matters or finance, but be much less supportive of harsh criminal penalties. And third, the same surveys consistently show that overwhelming majorities of Muslims in many of these countries also express strong support for democracy. They want democratic governance and laws reflecting their values.
So they don't necessarily see a contradiction there.
Exactly. They seem to desire a way to balance their faith identity with democratic principles, not necessarily choosing one over the other. So the data shows Sharia doesn't mean just one thing, even to its supporters. It's a contested concept, with a wide range of views on how it should be applied, to whom, and which aspects are most important. The simplistic, scary image is just not accurate.
That distinction between general support and support for harsh punishments is critical. So tying this together, the human rights record of a particular Muslim-majority country isn't an automatic result of Sharia itself, but reflects its political culture, its specific interpretation of fiqh, right? Can you give us some case studies showing this divergence, maybe on women's rights or minority rights?
Absolutely. The status of women under laws derived from Sharia provides a really stark illustration of how interpretation matters more than the source text itself. The variation across the Muslim world is dramatic. On one end of the spectrum, you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, where very conservative patriarchal interpretations of fiqh have been codified into state law, leading to significant restrictions on women's rights and autonomy. In Saudi Arabia, for example, despite some recent reforms like allowing women to drive, the 2022 personal status law still requires a woman to get permission from a male guardian, wali, to marry. It also links a husband's duty of financial support to his wife's obedience, which has historically been interpreted to include sexual relations.
Still embedded in the law.
Still there. In Iran, particularly following the Women Life Freedom protests triggered by Mahsa Amini's death, authorities have actually intensified the enforcement of compulsory veiling laws. They've introduced draconian new legislation with severe penalties, hefty fines, prison sentences, travel bans, even potentially the death penalty for promoting unveiling. Amnesty International has documented mass surveillance, car confiscations, denial of essential services to women defying these rules. A UN fact-finding mission suggested this might constitute the crime against humanity of persecution based on gender.
Truly draconian, but that's not the whole story.
Not at all, because at the other end of the spectrum, you have Muslim-majority countries that have undertaken significant legal reforms to enhance women's rights, explicitly drawing on more egalitarian interpretations of Islamic principles. Countries like Tunisia and Morocco, for example, have radically reformed their family law codes, the Moudawana in Morocco. These reforms grant women much greater rights in marriage, divorce, child custody, property ownership, moving significantly away from traditional patriarchal structures towards greater equality between spouses.
So same religious source, wildly different legal outcomes.
Precisely. It's not because they have different Qur'ans. It's because they have different human interpretations of the Qur'an and Sunnah, shaped by different political contexts, social movements, and scholarly approaches. Islamic feminist scholars have been crucial here, arguing forcefully that patriarchal interpretations have historically dominated, but that alternative non-patriarchal readings rooted in the Qur'an's core message of justice and equality are not only possible but more authentic.
That's a really powerful point about the role of interpretation. What about another contentious issue, like blasphemy laws, particularly in a place like Pakistan, where they are notoriously harsh?
Pakistan's blasphemy laws are another tragic case study showing the gap between religious principles and political application. The laws themselves are vaguely worded, carry incredibly severe penalties, life imprisonment, or even death, and have been systematically misused, disproportionately targeting religious minorities like Christians, Hindus, and especially the Ahmadiyya community, who are declared non-Muslim under Pakistani law. Human Rights Watch and other groups have documented extensively how these laws are exploited. It's often not about genuine religious offense.
How are they exploited?
False accusations are frequently leveled simply to settle personal vendettas, business disputes, or rivalries over land. Accusations are used to incite mob violence against minority individuals or communities, forcing them to flee their homes, which then allows accusers or mobs to seize their property. The mere accusation is often enough to endanger someone's life. The ease with which accusations can be made, combined with the frequent failure of police and judicial authorities to protect the accused or investigate properly, creates this pervasive climate of fear for minorities. There have been dozens, at least 89 documented cases since 1947 of people being killed extrajudicially by mobs after being accused of blasphemy, even before any trial.
So again, this isn't necessarily about the core tenets of Islam regarding respect for prophets, but about how these laws are politically weaponized.
Exactly. This case study clearly separates the religious text or principle from its political and social application. The critique isn't necessarily of Islam's stance on respecting religious figures, but of how Pakistan's state has codified these vague laws, failed to reform them despite clear evidence of abuse, and failed utterly to protect its citizens, especially minorities, from violence fueled by false accusations. It allows for a nuanced condemnation of these specific human rights abuses and state failures, without resorting to broad Islamophobic generalizations that condemn the entire faith based on the actions of one state or extremist mobs within it.
Okay, zooming out to the bigger political picture, how does Islam generally interact with the modern state, with democracy? Is there this inevitable push towards theocracy, as some fear, or is the reality more complex?
The relationship is definitely complex, dynamic, and deeply contested within Muslim societies themselves. It's not a settled question with a single answer. Across the Muslim world, societies are actively debating, struggling, experimenting with different ways to reconcile their Islamic values and heritage with the structures of the modern nation-state and the principles of democratic governance. It's a story of evolution, internal argument, and diverse outcomes, not some monolithic drive in one direction. When we talk about political Islam or Islamism, we need to remember it's a broad umbrella term for various modern ideologies and movements that seek to bring Islamic principles into the public sphere, into governance.
And it's not all the same, right?
Not at all. Islamism exists on a wide spectrum. You have gradualist, participatory political parties, like many affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood in different countries, who engage in elections and parliamentary politics. Then at the other extreme, you have the violent revolutionary jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda who reject the nation-state system entirely and seek to overthrow it through force. It's also worth noting that mainstream Islamist movements, the nonviolent ones, are actually in a period of profound crisis and rethinking right now. The twin shocks, as some analysts call them, the initial hopes and then failures of the 2011 Arab uprisings, the 2013 coup against the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, and the horrific rise of ISIS forced a lot of internal debate. They're grappling with questions about strategy, the role of violence versus gradualism, relationships with the state, how to build broad popular support. The outcomes of these internal debates will really shape the political future of the Middle East and other regions.
That sounds like a really significant internal reckoning happening.
Yeah.
And how does the desire for democracy fit into all this? Do ordinary Muslims actually want democratic governance?
The idea that Islam and democracy are inherently incompatible is strongly challenged by public opinion data. Survey after survey, particularly from Pew Research, consistently shows that majorities in many Muslim-majority countries actually prefer democracy over other forms of government. In 31 out of 37 countries surveyed by Pew a while back, at least half of Muslims said democracy was preferable to any other kind of government. Support is often very high in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana 87%, parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia 61%, and even many Arab nations, Lebanon 81%, Tunisia 75% at the time. Now, at the same time, many of those same people also say they want religion to play a significant role in their country's political life, and they might view Islamic political parties favorably.
So wanting both democracy and a role for Islam, how does that work?
It might seem like a contradiction from a purely secular Western perspective, but it's better understood as a desire, among many, to forge a path that feels both authentically democratic and authentically Islamic or true to their cultural values. The central political struggle in many of these societies isn't a simple binary choice, Islam or democracy. It's more often an internal debate about how to define a modern state that is both democratically governed and reflects the values and faith of its population. How do you bring those two together? That's the ongoing project.
And finally, just to complete the picture, how do Muslims integrate politically when they live as minorities in established Western democracies, like the U.S.? Does the data support the idea of some kind of subversive political agenda?
The data on Muslims in Western democracies completely defies those stereotypes. Let's take the United States as a prime example. Muslim Americans are actually a strongly Democratic-leaning constituency. Around two-thirds, 66% in a Pew survey, identify with or lean towards the Democratic Party. Only about 13% align with the Republican Party. Their policy views often align too. A large majority, 67%, favor a bigger government providing more services over a smaller one, which is generally a more democratic position. And crucially, an overwhelming majority of U.S. Muslims, 65%, explicitly say they see no conflict between the teachings of Islam and democracy. They see them as compatible. So these findings clearly show that when Muslims participate in pluralistic democratic systems, they tend to integrate politically based on their values, their interests, their socioeconomic positions, just like any other faith or ethnic group does. The narrative of some hidden subversive political threat is simply not supported by the actual evidence of their political behavior and attitudes. So if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, what we've really seen throughout this deep dive is, I hope, a much more nuanced evidence-based picture that cuts through those common, often harmful misconceptions. We've seen that Muslim culture isn't one thing. It's this incredibly diverse global tapestry of cultures, yes, unified by shared core beliefs, values, practices, but with a diversity that many see as divinely intended, rooted in a history of interaction and adaptation. We've established that the real danger lies not in Islam itself, but in these specific modern revolutionary political ideologies of a violent extremist fringe ideologies that are vehemently rejected by mainstream scholars and institutions and whose primary victims are often other Muslims. The perception of a generalized Muslim danger is largely a construct fueled by historical Islamophobia and amplified by biased media. We explored the psychological dimension, the complex identity navigation, the mental health challenges exacerbated by Islamophobia, but also the remarkable resilience often fostered by faith and community, leading to unique approaches like Islamic psychology. And finally, we tackled Sharia. The Sharia takeover is a myth. Sharia refers to divine principles. Its actual application, fiqh, is human interpretation, leading to diverse legal systems. And public opinion consistently shows a desire for democracy alongside Islamic values, not a rejection of it.
This deep dive has really hammered home, for me at least, how absolutely critical it is to look beyond the headlines, beyond the simple narratives. Whenever we're talking about any complex global community, we've seen just how much internal debate rich history and profound diversity really shape things. So maybe a final thought for you to chew on as you go forward. How might you apply this understanding, this appreciation for deep-seated diversity, for internal debates, for the gap between ideal and reality? How might you apply that lens to other complex global communities or issues that often get flattened out and oversimplified in our public discourse? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.